So stop listening to economists. They'll never get it right. See, so their forecasting things will completely mislead you. And so then if you get misled, you'll make poor decisions. So that's why I encourage developers especially to understand land. And they're the natural people to do so, because at the end of the day, it's what you buy your land for that determines much of your profit.
You are listening to the Property Developer Podcast, your home for tips, ideas and inspiration to help take your developing to the next level. Now here's your host, Justin Getty.
Hello and welcome to episode 108 of the show. How are you doing? Keeping well? Hopefully your projects are on track. I've got a terrific show coming up for you today with a great guest discussing a thought-provoking topic around property cycles and economics. Just before we get to that, here's what I've been up to. Sadly, the builder failed to achieve the practical completion date that they said they would achieve about a month ago, and still have quite a bit to do to wrap things up. I reckon there's probably still 4 to 6 weeks worth of work to do. There's a bit of landscaping to be done, some touch-ups, and a whole bunch of just little things to do, as well as a couple of big rectification jobs. It's been an incredibly frustrating experience, this build, but we are pretty close to finishing, and it's certainly a better position than where I was a year ago with the builder stopping work. Anyway, I'm confident that we'll at least finish this year, which is going to be great. Now, after listening to today's episode, you might be fired up to get that property development dream underway and be ready to tap into what's ahead for the property markets. So, if you are, then be sure to check out my Property Developer Training. It's my signature program to show you everything you need to start and finish your first small-scale residential development project. Check out everything that's included in the training at www.propertydevelopertraining.com. Or if you want to find out how ready you are to become a property developer, then take the free quiz at propertydevelopertraining.com/quiz. and see what score you get. And finally, don't forget you can catch me on the socials under the handle of Property Developer Podcast. You can see all the latest from my sites and keep up with what I'm doing. All right, on to today's guest, Phillip Anderson from Property Sharemarket Economics. Phil is the author of the book, The Secret Life of Real Estate and Banking. He's also an investment analyst and an investor. Phil's book outlines a seemingly recurring economic cycle that takes around 18 years to complete and has a major impact on the property market. Understanding the rhythm and cycle of the market is obviously extremely beneficial to property developers, so I wanted to have this conversation to help you with your investing and developing. I think there are some great insights from Phil's work. In this conversation, we cover the 18-year real estate cycle and how it affects developers, Phil's thoughts on where we are in the current cycle and what's coming in the next few years, and how to get set to maximize the potential opportunities that may be on the horizon. I really enjoyed speaking with Phil, and I'm sure you will enjoy this conversation. I hope it sparks some interest and curiosity. I will preface it by saying nothing in this conversation is financial advice. You need to do your own research and investigation before making any investment decisions. Okay, let's get stuck right in by finding out what Phil would eat until he was sick.
Chocolate, too much, already been sick. No, I'm careful with diet now. I'm also largely vegetarian too, for very good reasons.
Oh, yes. What are they?
To improve my vibration level, help understanding.
Yeah, tell us more.
That's a GAN thing. It's just and for moral reasons too, about animals and things. But no, it's also important for health reasons. The older I get.
Very good.
I won't go into it, but
no, that's
okay. A personal thing.
No, understandable. Well, there's nothing wrong with eating healthy and being healthy. So, chocolates.
Well, I think
get stuck on.
I think about as I'm well known for the real estate cycle, and I have done property development as well, so I'm familiar with the process. I think when the real estate cycle, when we see the extreme in a couple of years' time, once it turns down, I think we're going to get very violent, exceeding violence. I think both in economies and economics and monetary phenomenon. It'll be so extreme. The debts are so high now. We're going to need good health, and it's important, becoming more important than ever now.
Oh, that's good. You're
That's
getting
what I
ahead of
see.
the curve.
Yes.
Well, I don't know where to start now that you've mentioned that you've done some property development, but let's not start there. For people who don't know who you are, can you give us a bit of a background? You're kind of known as Mr. 18-year economic cycles, I guess, to most people, but let's wind the clock back a little bit, pardon the pun, and give us a bit of a background
Well,
on Phil Anderson.
yeah, it's funny, my interest is in stock markets and trading, and I've followed the works of W.T. Gann. I'm probably one of the few persons in the world that came to Gann and market timing from a real estate perspective. But I have written my book, The Secret Life of Real Estate and Banking. I have written that about real estate cycles, and that's primarily trying to understand 18.6-year real estate cycles. But that began because I've always had a bent on economics. I did a lot of economics at school and then at university. I don't really know why as such. It just took my interest. And once I got into economics a little bit at school and then first to university, what I was being taught at university and what I was reading simply did not accord. You could not relate it to real life. And so I just remember myself making a pledge that I would get to the bottom of understanding why economists couldn't seem to get their forecasts right and why they didn't seem to have a clue about what was happening in the real world. You know, they made all these assumptions about humanity being rational and would make the right decisions in the right circumstances. I mean, you know, as you know, and as I'm sure you know very well, I know, that's the furthest from the truth that you can ever get. None of us are rational. We're always making decisions based on emotions and this and that. And the economics department didn't seem to have anything to do with it. And so way back when, in the 1980s, I resolved that I would go travelling because I cashed in everything I owned and I got a bit sick of working for someone else. I cashed in everything I owned and simply decided I'd go around the world, and I wasn't going to come back until I'd solved the questions I had with economics. I just wanted to see a bit of the world. And, you know, people who've known me a long time, I sometimes tell the story that I got to India and I was in New Delhi and I was late to get to the bank. And back in those days, in India at least, you know, if you wanted to get some money from a bank or cash a traveller's check, it would take you half the day. So I had to get there early, and I was in a New Delhi squat and came bounding out of the hostel I was in and went straight into the back of an elephant that was being paraded through the small streets of Delhi. And it put me into the gutter, and I sat next to a emaciated man that was sitting under a barrel load of the most magnificent fruit I'd ever seen. And then it hit me, if you're going to forecast economics, if you're going to forecast the world and what's going to happen, you have to know a little bit about land. And that's really what began. And when I got back home to Australia in 1987 or thereabouts, I started looking all about things, and I realised that economics knows nothing about it. And that led me to studying land economics, and it led me to Fred Harrison, The Power in the Land, because it was now 1989, 1990, and here was Melbourne especially. I don't know if you'd recall it, but if you're old enough to remember the 1991 downturn in Melbourne, it was really severe. You know, unemployment was the statistic for government was that unemployment about 12%, but I can tell you it was probably way higher. Certainly in Melbourne, way higher than 15%. And by definition, in economics, 15% unemployment is a depression, not just recession. And I was doing a bit of work back then, and Paul Keating was in the top chair. And, you know, the government did some very smart things. They decided to take people off unemployment benefits and put them into training camps. And I was doing some work training people. And so that reduced unemployment even further, right? Smart from a government point of view, but cheating, really. And then one thing led to another, and I was given a copy of Fred Harrison's book, Power in the Land, and he wrote that in 1983, and he forecast in that book that the world, and especially the UK, because he was writing for UK stuff, by 1991 the world would be in the throes of a very severe recession. And lo and behold, I'm reading the book, and that's what happened. And Fred wrote that 7 years in advance. That mightily impressed me. Now, I was doing some accounting work back then. I was also working in my father's business. And I read Fred's book, and I thought, there's a business opportunity here. If I could set up my own small business and then correctly start forecasting future economic activity, I could run my own business. And I sort of worked out by the time 1991 came along that I was basically unemployable as a staff member, right? So I just wanted to be in my own business, and that's what I've done since then. I've just been writing about economics and writing and building my subscriber base. And I realised once Fred had done his book, The Power in the Land, he wrote about the UK. I realised that if there was more money to be had in the US market, if I could work out what US real estate cycles were doing, do a book on it, and then start talking about things, I could probably have a good business on my hands that would enable me to do my own thing basically for the rest of my life. And fortunately, that's what I've been able to do. And when I put my book together, A Secret Life of Real Estate and Banking, once I started writing, I did some research. Now, Justin, you got to understand, this is pre-internet, right? Where this is back in the dinosaur years. I would have, if I wanted some information in the US book, I'd have to go to the Melbourne Library up there. It used to be on top of Swanson Street. I'd have to go there. I'd have to request a book from the US. They'd send it to Australia. I'd sign for it, read the book in the library, and then I'd have to send it back, right? I mean, it's just I just don't know how anything got done in those days, right? But eventually I put the information together. And one of the first books and pieces of information I came across, because in America they keep statistics on absolutely everything. Fortunately, I was able to see some of the land sales going back to the very beginning in 1770, right through the 1800s and 1900s in the US. You just wouldn't believe it, but land sales in the United States peaked every 18 years. I mean, it was just astounding. And I realised then that in the US, there's been a lot of people write about one particular recession or depression in the United States, but absolutely nobody had written about all of them together and then linked them to do with real estate and land sales and land value and buying and selling of real estate. So I realised then I had to put that all together. And then, once I put my book out, your status goes up because they know you've had an authentic book published, and that's not an easy thing, and people recognise that, and I've been grateful ever since. The book, if I may say so modestly, a bit ironic, my book is now in the top 20 best-selling all-time banking books. Would you believe it? It's a book about real estate, but it's in the banking section, which goes to show you that just the lack of understanding about the land market, right? So, so this is critical for developers because most developers and most people in the market, generally, they only ever see land prices going one way, and that's upwards. And, the cycle shows clearly, and I've shown it in my book, and Fred showed it, the cycle's generally 14 years up, 4 down. And the timing is absolutely crucial because and when you get towards the end of each real estate cycle, it's really easy to be over your head in debt because the banks are trying to swamp you with money, and it's really easy to be in the wrong way. And these are life-defining decisions. If you get in the wrong way and the economy tanks whilst you're heavily in debt, it can destroy everything, just destroy family life, destroy everything, right? And I have a decent affinity with developers, if I may say, distinct from speculators. People who just speculate in a block of land or land outside on the periphery of Melbourne and cities, right? They're speculators as such. I don't see developers in that area. Developers generally trying to get good quality land and build a good quality building or a house and get people living in there and make a decent profit whilst they're doing it. Developers are important in any economy, and it's important that they they get things right and make good decisions and be able to build good quality stuff for people so that we all can live in good circumstances where we want to. Very important, you know. And of course, every city today, as it ages, and in Melbourne, of course, there are and Sydney too, and most other places, there are, you know, I'm thinking saying just in Melbourne, you know, it's around, say, Box Hill, going down to you know, right out towards to Mentone and all those other places. There are a lot of houses now that are dumps that sit on a decent block that really ought to be a better house. It ought to be more well developed so that people live in high quality housing that's got really good internet connections rather than the crap that a lot of people are familiar with. So I'm supportive of developers. I've done that myself.
Yeah, so we're going to get to your property development. I'm very keen to hear about that. And that was the reason that I wanted to have this discussion with you around understanding the cycles, because as a developer, you can then see when's a good time to plow in, when's a good time to pull back, and
Yes.
to understand how those cycles work, because you talk to most people and they'll say there's a 7-year cycle.
Yes. Well, that's fair. I'd break it down by 7 years. That's fair. It's just that about every 7th year or so, we tend to get a bit of a mild recession. And then it's when you get the next 7, the end of the next 7th year, so that's 14 years, 2 by 7, the 14th year or so, that downturn tends to be land price led. And that's the difference between a downturn we might have seen in the last couple of years. Land prices don't collapse, but the next downturn, land prices are due to decline. And that's what makes it more serious. So we're talking, say, 2008, we're talking 1991, 1974, and before that, you're going back towards 1955, and then back into the Great Depression, right? Which is not similar now, that I wouldn't bring up, but certainly it's those downturns that are led by the decline in land price. And I can't tell you why so much, but there clearly is that rhythm. But it's important to highlight as well, the rhythm is in the US. And it's the US that you have to watch. Now, I keep telling Australian audiences, you don't have to understand the US system. You've just got to watch what the US is doing. And that can give Australians quite a great advantage because, at least in the past, Australia's been about 6 to 12 months behind what happens in the US. And so certainly by 2008, when the US is having its downturn, things still hadn't moved a great deal in Australia. It gave the Australian government and participants a little bit of breathing space because the Australian government could introduce a few rescue saving measures that meant the downturn didn't have to be as severe, right? So, but I think for the next downturn, which is due after 2026, I don't think it's going to be so easy to fix this time in the US. So it's the US. The timing has to be watched in the US, not Australia. Usually, Australia's got so much land that Australia could just keep expanding indefinitely until America stops, right? So that's why I watch America, not Australia. Australia doesn't lead the real estate cycle. It's the US that leads. And now you've got involvement of China as well now. So we've got to take our cue from what happens in the US. I can tell you at the moment, the US is going gangbusters. It really is. There's an enormous amount happening. There are a few pockets of trouble, but it's not enough to worry about yet. And I think there's some very good years coming. So that will give now developers, particularly in Australia, a good chance to put their house in order, put their business in order over the next 3 or 4 years. Well, say 30 to 36 months. If the history of the real estate cycle is to repeat, you now need to put your house in order. You need to have your debts covered. You need to be watching what happens, and you don't want to be in a position where the banks seek to get the utmost from you to back your developments and everything else. It's a time now to be just putting your things in order. That doesn't mean stopping work. It just means a little bit of care when it comes to the debt.
Just to quickly give a summary to somebody who hasn't read the book or understand the cycle, see if I can get it right. So let's start from the hangover, the
Yes.
recession or the depression that comes from the exuberance before, but we'll get to that.
Yes.
Start off with that slow recessionary period that lasts for sort of 3 or 4 years. Then you get a 6-7 year run up to
Well, let me on page 360 of my book, I've got a clock, and that lists the activities that happen around the 18-year cycle. So it's 14 years up, 4 down. But out of the recession, out of 2008, 2009, what happens? I'm sure developers would understand this, but it's a little bit perverse or perverted for some people who don't really getting in the market. What generally happens is the rents rise, okay, because people there's usually the housing shortage. Rents rise because demand for housing actually goes up despite the prices coming down a little bit. And so we're talking residential at the moment. But once, after a couple of years of the downturn, once the price of established buildings bottoms out or then begins to rise a little bit because rents go up, once eventually the process sorts itself out and the prices of established buildings start to rise, it then becomes cheaper to start to build. And so developers then who've survived the downturn, they start acquiring or accumulating, or if they've been cashed up, they start buying cheap land. It starts to become profitable for them to build. So they start building. And once they do start building, that usually means the downturn's over and things start to become a little bit more profitable. There's always a bit of care about because people remember the prior downturn. But by that stage, we got into 2013, 2014, generally things start to go up. By that stage, stock markets have recovered, usually after about 4 years or so. Certainly US stock markets, they're back into all-time new highs. Confidence comes back. People are again making money because the stock market's going up. There's a bit more profit around. And so things have recovered and we start to forget what was happening in the past. Usually we get to about, 7 years in or so from about 2000, let's say 2010, 2011, 12. Then you get a little bit of a hiccup. Something normally happens that leads to a sort of like a mid-cycle crisis. That gives people pause for thought, but usually land prices don't decline. Now, in the past couple of years, this current cycle we're in, we had a pandemic. This was, it was terribly difficult. Nobody could forecast that sort of stuff. Well, whilst you could see as part of the real estate cycle, as part of the having just done 7 years in, probably due a downturn, but certainly, certainly least of all me was expecting that sort of pandemic thing. So that didn't make things easy. It was certainly difficult for many developers, as you can imagine. But it's mid-cycle. Now, it's mid-cycle, the land price doesn't decline. It also means that banks can do things and government can do things to alleviate the process. Normally, demand for real estate, demand for housing stays high. So you usually get a situation like we've got now, when not enough houses have been built, demand is still existing and high. So it kicks off the second half of the real estate cycle, which is we are in now. And so normally, as we go into the final stages of the real estate cycle, the next 3 or 4 years, things go usually, if the cycle is to repeat, and I demonstrate this in my book, which I do encourage your viewers to read, we start to go into high gear now. This is because we've got new technology gets invented, AI, things become exceedingly bullish. US stock markets again hit all-time new highs, which they've just done. That means that puts people into decent profit. Banks, very, very important, banks start making profits again because their margin starts to spread, which means what they receive on a loan is less than what they pay for is more than what they receive on their loans their interest rate differential is far more profitable. So as you've seen, I haven't explained that very well, but banks start to make better profits because as interest rates go up, they start making more on their lending and they don't have to pay as much out for deposits. So it can be usually a profitable time. Once the banks start making more profits, they eventually will lend more, as they'll start to do. And then, and you'll see this coming up, because it does get a little bit more expensive with mortgages and things, and because there's usually a housing crisis by this stage or a rental accommodation crisis, governments and banks then have to start to be creative to find out how to get people to borrow more. And that kicks off the final stage of the real estate cycle. And this is what we're approaching now. And so I think it'll be a good time for developers. But again, just be wary of going 100% into debt at exactly the wrong time in a couple of years' time, which is when it's the easiest to do. I hope I've explained it all right. I hope that makes sense. But I do encourage, the book's all there.
Yeah, look, I've been reading your book at the moment, and absolutely is worth getting.
It's eye-opening, right? It's just not, I should mention as well, Justin, that economics has been corrupted. It really has. I've got a book here. It's called The Corruption of Economics. The topic of land, it was between the First and Second World Wars, the topic of land was written completely out of economics. This was a conspiracy. It was deliberate. It's documented by Mason Gaffney and Fred Harrison in the book. I encourage, you can get an ebook of that pretty much anywhere now on Amazon or on the publisher's website. So there used to be three factors of production: land, labour and capital. Into the Second World War, that was deliberately made into two, so land became capital. So you've got a situation today where not one single economist in any economic institution will understand the role of land. And so they'll never be able to forecast accurately, because at the end of the day, it is land and what we call economic rent, and what I'm sure developers would understand as locational advantage. Economists don't know what that is. They see that as part of capital. So it's just, so stop listening to economists. They'll never get it right. See, so their forecasts and things will completely mislead you. And so then if you get misled, you'll make poor decisions. So that's why I encourage developers especially to understand land. And they're the natural people to do so, because at the end of the day, it's what you buy your land for that determines much of your profit. And you've got to get it in a decent location. And I also find, once you've read my book and Fred Harrison's book, you get a much better understanding of location, and you get a much better understanding of where you should be buying to help you attract people to your location, which at the end of the day increases the land value and helps you sell for more. I mean, it's pretty easy stuff at the end of the day, but so few people actually get to see it.
Yeah, you definitely go through the law of economic rent in that book, and Fred.
Yes.
And then your partner, Akhil, is that?
Yes. Yeah, my co-director, Akhil Patel.
Okay, yep. So he just also released a book last year that I read.
He's done really well. He's taken my book and he's made it a bit more practical in the sense of describing what happens at every point in the real estate cycle. He's broken that down into on a yearly basis. The repeat is astounding. What do you call it? The Secret Wealth Advantage, I think, was the book. What he called it. It's great. It's fantastic. Even I've learned stuff from it though. And he goes into economic rent and the laws and stuff and things. Right. It's fabulous. So I strongly encourage your viewers to get on it. They won't read anything that's more valuable to their business than understanding that. And then, of course, listening to podcasts like yourself, who's in practice in the field. It's definitely useful.
Yeah, absolutely worth reading all those books. And I actually gave Akhil's book to my dad for Christmas.
Nice.
Christmas.
Nice.
Yeah. Get stuck in.
That's good.
But yes, I mean, simply speaking, the law of economic rent is just this idea that a piece of land should pay its way for improving in value, which blocks of land.
Well, you can see it. You can see it. It's very clearly demonstrated. I'll always remember, when I think it was the big issue. There were a couple of guys that wanted to help unemployed people or homeless people make some money. So they decided that they'd create a magazine called The Big Issue and then have the street kids and whatever sell it, right? But the street kids, being very street smart, they very quickly worked out that you can sell more of The Big Issue, say on the corner of Burke and Swanston, than you can if you go out to a suburb in Mentone and stand on a street corner and try and sell it there, right? So very quickly, the street guys worked out that the earlier they got up to claim their particular piece of pavement where they could start to sell more, so for the same amount of effort, they got a higher return. That surplus return is what economists call economic rent. Developers would understand that as locational advantage. Well, very quickly, the street sellers started to resort, particularly in America, to guns and knives to protect the location that they were finding. Now, that, in a sense, in a nutshell, is exactly what's happening in Ukraine, where the Russians invaded, because the Ukraine's got lots of resources, not to mention the ability to grow wheat and all the minerals there, right? So it's just a bigger escalation of the same thing, chasing that something for nothing. Once you get to see that, I'm certain that developers, you'll make better decisions.
The location is a property saying for a very good reason, Phil.
Yes, and why people subscribe to me is because timing. You can still buy the best location on the planet and get in, but if you buy at exactly the peak of the cycle, you're done.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point that you make in the book, is just knowing when not to overcommit and be ready.
That's correct.
For
That's
it.
correct. I believe that's the secret. I believe that's the secret. You've just got to know when. Yes.
There's a cycle. It hits a peak, but
yes.
I remember back in 2008 or 2009 when Melbourne was at its peak in the last cycle, and it was so frothy. I just remember at the time there was just this pervasive sense that if you weren't buying property, you were missing out, and there was just this sense that real, like, tangible FOMO that was everywhere in society, all through the papers, and you could just feel it. And then it busted.
Yes.
After that.
Yes. Well, I think that's coming again. My book details the timing. So does Achilles, and it's timing. It's really important this time, and I think this time is going to be even more critical. Talking about the US, not so much Australia, perhaps. The debts are high now. They're worrying even me. They're unprecedented in some ways. So it's worth knowing when to be prudent now, definitely. And Australia will not be in a position, I don't think, any further at the end of the next cycle. I don't think China will be in a position to come to our rescue this time by being able to print lots of money and build stuff. And it was so beneficial to Australia right through 2010, 2011, when China kept buying our commodities. This is not going to happen again. I also think if people panic a little bit about the US and their debts, this could be worrisome for the value of the US dollar. If people start to worry about the US dollar and its replacement or stuff, this is possibly something to think through again as well. You certainly won't want to be overcommitted at the end of the next cycle. Certainly not.
But from my understanding and reading some of your work, we are entering into a second boom phase in the back half of the cycle.
Yes, I think there's great. Yes, historically,
could be. Hear that.
Yes. No, I think the next few years will be really good. Be a great time to be a developer. I think the next few years. Just don't overcommit at the top. But historically, and again, I am making an assumption here that the cycle repeats as it always has. But as you can read from my work with what I do currently, I've been pretty good at forecasting the past 10 years. It's been pretty much spot on. I expect that to continue as far as the real estate cycle repeats. I think we're in for some very good couple of years, and history suggests, and should that cycle repeat, that every cycle's been bigger than the one before it, at least into the top. And there's no reason why that can't happen again. It's just massive, the changeover from combustion engines to electric vehicles. That's going to change people's lives. It's massive with AI and what can happen. I would suggest in the next couple of years that practically every company is going to have to become a tech company. The things they're going to be able to do, that'll be extremely productive for for several years. But when land price does turn down at the end of the cycle, then that's when everything goes into reverse. And so that's when you're just going to have your wits about you. And if you've studied history, and all the history is in my book, you will, I can guarantee you, after you've read my book, you will be able to have a rough idea of what's coming next, because it's all in the clock. It's just, everything's been going like clockwork since 2008, since I released the book. And developers have a great advantage there because they get to see it on the ground. So I'm amazed sometimes they don't get it as quick as they ought to.
Yeah, and that was something I wanted to ask you. Just doesn't seem to be so well known, this 18-year cycle. And what's your thinking behind that? Why don't people know about it?
You're quite right. It's funny, I get a number of my subscribers, almost always the first thing they say to me, having subscribed, they say, "Phil, I wish I'd seen your material 15 years ago." It's always practically the first thing they say, right? I've noticed that quite a number of my subscribers, they come to me last. They seem to have to go through everything else first to prove to everything else that it doesn't work. Then they get to me. I can also tell you that the ownership of, well, you would in layman's term, you'd say the ownership of land, but it isn't really the ownership of land. It's the ownership of what the land generates. So it's the ownership of the economic rent. It's the ownership of the locational value. And as most people in the game would know, you don't actually have to own the piece of land outright. It doesn't have to be yours. It can be mortgaged to a bank. What you've got to have at the end of the day is not necessarily the title, but the claim on the title, which is the collection of that economic rent. That's what you've got to have. Now, the claim on that, or the ownership, mostly, the ownership of that in large pieces of land can actually bring a lot of power. And so if you look at the UK, the House of Lords, right, which is the ultimate power base, the largest landowners in the UK sit in that house. And if they don't like a piece of legislation coming through, it doesn't get passed, because they own the land. And so ownership of land can bring with it quite substantial power. Those people, they don't want that power jeopardized. So at the end of the day, what I do isn't really economics, it's politics. And you can see the same goes in the US. I mean, America's first president number one, George Washington, he was at the time America's largest landowner. Now you look at the prior president, Mr. Trump, and vying again to become president again, he's a real estate developer. And the first thing he did as president was to lower the taxes on real estate. This is the power base. And so again, some of this economic information, the powers that be, they don't want you to know this. And so it was deliberately written out of economics. And that's why I urge people to get behind the situation and understand the land. And once you've worked out why this isn't taught at university, you work out what it is you've got to understand, because it's power play, really. And it's really important. And so now, as you can see, the prior president in the US, he established a space force, a military space force. Why does he do that? Because he wants the US to get to the moon and the asteroids and to be able to mine those things. The US will not be able to mine that without it being backed up militarily. Hence, he needs a space force to back up the ownership and the claim that Elon Musk and other space miners will eventually have to those resources. And that's the game. If you can see that, you're halfway on your way to be able to time that process. Because at the end of the day, I think timing is more important than the location. But of course, location is important as well. But that's just where I come from.
Yeah, and basically the theory is that it's the extraction of the economic rent that then causes the fluctuations in the economy and the boom and the bust, the big peaks and the big.
Exactly right. It's the extraction. It's the it's the chasing of that economic rent, the locational value, that causes the cycle. But the height of the real estate boom and then the depth of the bust, that's determined by just how much credit gets created by the banks. And certainly at the moment, and history shows you that there's always a demand for credit, and often the higher land prices go, the bigger the demand for credit. Banks love land prices going higher. It means they can lend more demand, and that determines how high the extreme will be. And with the move of interest rates back upwards to their normal position, they're not high by any standards, historically speaking. They're higher now because it does give trouble to people already borrowing highly. But the higher they go, the more creative the banks have to get people to borrow money. And so they do get creative and come up with all these schemes. So now you're seeing the home loans or no deposit home loans and things now that's starting to happen. The governments want to get re-elected. They have to cater to the housing market. They have to make it easier for people to get on the market. And as I'm sure you'll be aware, once the government creates a scheme, so I don't know, a home buyer scheme or a give away 20k to new home buyers, that capitalises immediately into locational value, and that leads us into the end of the cycle. So it's coming.
Yeah, well, I think the Australian federal government will be looking at the levers that they can pull at the moment, because they're not looking so good in the polls, and
yes,
Minister Albanese doesn't want to be a once-up.
Yes,
so
that's correct. And if he doesn't suggest something, the opposition will. So to get elected, pressure.
Yeah, with a federal election in the next 12 months, you can bet your bottom dollar there's going to be lots of ideas thrown around by the federal government to give to homeowners or property
giveaways. Well, it's your money, not theirs, you see, so they don't care.
Yes, yep. I know that, so in some of these books, there's the concept that if you didn't have this economic rent being extracted, you wouldn't get the booms and the busts. And the wealth would be shared across the community. I think the Victorian government seems to have taken that to heart, because they've been putting in place all sorts of property and land taxes to try and do their own extraction of rent. Is that in response to that, and is that something that's fair for the community?
Well, it's a good question. My answer has two parts there. First up, I consider it unfair in the sense that you cannot increase the land taxes if you also increase the taxes on ordinary working people. Both will end up bankrupting the economy. What I favour myself, which I've been putting out from time to time, is a slight shift in the base to actually raise revenue more from resources and tax people less. So if I was the Prime Minister, I would tax a little bit more heavily the rent resource companies, and I would completely eliminate income tax. That would be my first policy if I was ever elected, which is highly unlikely, but that's what I would do. So I would make it far easier for working class people to actually get more money in their pocket, so they could afford things, which I think would make everybody better off. In return for the no taxes on their income, I would have a slightly higher tax base on land and resources. That would be my thing. Now, if you took that to the extreme, which is a policy I favour because I detest government, I would abolish all taxes completely, and I would also abolish most politician and government activity, and then just replace it with the collection of the economic rent for society. Right now, I know this is an extreme position probably, and I'm more libertarian than others. But if you carry through the knowledge in my book and Arkell's book, if you carry it through, you can see the logic of where that goes. And if you ever did that, the first person to benefit would be developers, small developers, because the demand would go through the roof for people's improvement, living conditions and everything else, right? So I would see that as a benefit, really. But of course, I understand, this, the most hated tax in the world is the land tax, rightfully so, because governments are trying to tax everything else at the same time. And it's unfair. It's unfair in the extreme. So whilst I support a changeover of position, if you're going to tax one, you've got to untax the other. And that's what governments don't do. They're always searching for more and more money to spend more and more stuff, right? And it's manifest. All it's doing is just growing the size of government, and that's not going to solve any. That's not going to solve any issues at all. It just makes things more complicated. Because my rule number one in an economic sense, talking about the Federal Reserve, the Fed's always behind the curve. But my rule number two is governments at all times will make things worse. That's just what happens. And so, hence my position of trying to phase out government as such. But that's a political question. It's not an economic question, and I don't dwell on that. But I do urge people who read my book and others that if they subscribe to try and understand that position, because I explain it to them in that way because I think it will make them better investors. And that's basically the emphasis behind my service. It's not about trying to sprout political systems. It's about trying to make my subscribers the best possible investor that they can be. And step number one to do that is to understand what economic rent is, or location or value as such. Because at the end of the day, the stock market's built on it as well. Banks have worked out how to monetize the economic rent. Mining companies, they've worked out how to extract it. And 50% of the Australian market's built on it.
Yeah, speaking of taxes, a classic example of that in Australia was the federal government had the luxury car tax that they had to protect the local car industry.
Yeah.
And then once I don't know if you remember, all the local manufacturers shut up shop, but suddenly we still have that tax in place.
Yes.
Even though we have no industry.
Yeah, I think there's about 150 separate taxes in Australia now. It's just ludicrous, It's just so difficult now for small business, to start up. I mean, it's even worse in some other places, of course. But it's a great shame, The politics just making the situation more and more difficult for everybody. Just should make it easier for people to start and create businesses. The number one important business is proper land developers and proper builders, regulated, sure, but make sure that a good job is done, no corners cut. But it's really important that people live in high quality amenities, well produced, well built, so they can live well and improve the circumstances in which they're in. I just don't think there's anything more important, really.
Well, governments love property development, because it's got such an awesome multiplier effect. So you can spend they can say they pump in $1 and it produces $10 of output. Yes. The problem is, of course, it remained. Yeah, I agree. I just wish they just the infill a bit of Melbourne first before so much sprawl. But no, that's another topic, probably. One that's been discussed at length.
Yes.
But now that you touch on that, you mentioned you'd done some developing in the past. What sort of stuff have you done?
Yes, that's my bent from a political sense, in the sense that I hate seeing vacant land in the middle of cities. I've been to some cities around the world where they're farming, and we've got rice farms and paddy fields in the middle of huge where buildings ought to be. So I've made an effort over the years at various times to buy up, one or two small pieces of residential blocks and build a house and get somebody living there. I can't say I'm the most successful person at it, but I've made money over the years. I did that in London the last decade and a half, more so than Australia. That's just my thing, really. I don't like seeing large swathes of vacant land. I think people should be living there, or a building should be on it that actually produces something. I think that would be far more beneficial for society. And I hate, even more so than vacant land, I hate seeing derelict houses or derelict buildings. I think it's immoral. There's people unemployed there, or the people should be living there. And I can't talk so much about Australia. Australia does generally fairly well overall by world standards, but let's say in Great Britain, there are more than 1 million houses empty around the UK. It's a lot of housing, and there's so much people living on the streets. It's not so bad at the moment, but it'll get worse as land price goes higher. That's what I would fix first. Just bring derelict and underused or vacant land back into production to improve people's and society's living standards. It's important, and developers have a role in that.
Yeah, and the government has an important role to play as well. I mean, they're the gateway into providing the supply, but they make it quite challenging to be able to get projects underway.
Yes,
Planning.
which at the end of the day also leads to corruption, which is a great shame.
I wanted to ask you about Australia, particularly we're going through a significant period of immigration. We've got building starts are down, and there seems to be a sort of build-up of demand, that we're getting slow building starts and cost of money and cost of building is high. Does that change your view of what might happen specifically in Australia over the next 2-3 years?
No, I think that's the real estate cycle in play. That's really what we ought to be seeing now. It's got to drive all of that. Those events have to drive us into the peak of the real estate cycle. And so now we've got to get more building, and it'll happen. And generally the overbuilding will happen right at the peak. You know, you'll probably see in the next couple of years somebody announce somewhere the world's tallest building, perhaps in Australia. You know, there'll be some great, huge development that comes out when credit's easier and almost at its easiest at the peak, when banks have got a flush with money and developer comes up with a grand scheme or a grand idea. Saudi Arabia, Middle East, the Dubai, they're doing some enormous projects. I think that'll feed off into other places. You might even see the Emirates or Saudi Arabia developer come into Australia and say, now we've done our own stuff, we want to build something in Australia that'll be fantastic for Australia, and this icon development, right? That happens here at the peak.
Yeah, I just finished reading a book called Billionaires Row last year. It was about some expensive towers in New York that were getting built, and as the frenzy came in 08, 07, around then, when people were kind of jumping in, building these huge towers, and then the market collapsed and they're in big trouble. Still
Timing.
Not finished.
Yep, I think we'll see a repeat, but not yet. A couple of years to go yet.
I wanted to ask whether the US market, in terms of the way they treat the mortgages over there, they have fixed rate mortgages over long periods of time, whether that smooths out their property market. Doesn't seem to. Whereas Australia...
it's a good question. The US is a little different. You know, Australians are tied to their mortgage much more so than in the United States. I don't claim I'm an expert in either market, but it is the ability to be more flexible in the United States that drives the market more high and lower. And the United States also has a market called Wall Street that are specialists in delivering what the people want at even more speculative times. And Wall Street's very good at packaging up stuff. And so we'll see the same thing develop. And that enables in the US to just drive markets that little bit higher and further. So in the US at the moment, they're probably in a situation where there's quite a number of people who hold those long-term mortgages that are at low rates. They can't move. They can't take out a new mortgage from the old one because things have changed, circumstances changed such a bit. So they are in a sense locked into their old one. Slightly different in Australia. So it's again a slightly different market. But I think over the long term it has a similar effect. It will drive the cycle.
And what do you say to people who go, prices are so expensive now? Your Eastern Seaboard capitals, property prices seem ridiculous. How can they go higher? How can we have a frenzy phase coming up?
Well, I don't blame the question. In a way, they're right to ask the question, but it's never about price. First, it's always about location, but even more important than that, it's about earnings. It's never about price. It's about earnings and future earnings. And so from a bank's point of view, they don't look at price. They look at what you can afford. And so if the banks and the government come up with more ingenious ways for people to have the ability to afford the price, then price has got nothing to do with it. So don't look at the price. You look at what can be afforded, or methods in which the banks and the government can make it more affordable. So focusing on price is not necessarily the first thing you want to be looking at. That's not to suggest that you shouldn't be like, say, Alan Bond years ago, where he knew the price of everything but the value of nothing. As a developer, you've got to see the value, but it's not, from a point of view of land price, it's not just about the land price as such, or the price. It's about how that price can be afforded, so from a residential viewpoint, and from a commercial viewpoint, earnings, and then you factor in the interest rates and everything else, right? So, to those who ask about how prices can go higher, they can go a lot higher yet if creative ways can be found to afford that price. And we might end up with 40-year mortgages. We might end up with mortgages tied not only to the parents but to the kids. All sorts of things can happen yet to make that to drive that jump.
Yeah, and there'll be a huge transfer of wealth in the next 15, 20 years as well, as the boomers move along and pass on their wealth to their children. There's a big stack of money there to get moved across.
Yes.
That might drive the next one. That could be your new book.
Could be.
Yeah, because you just talk to people and they're like, how can property prices go higher? You go, well, it's just about the availability of credit and how much money you can get. That's what will drive it.
The same question was asked in 2003 and 2004. Same question was asked in 1983. Heck, I remember buying my first house. I paid an interest rate of 17.5% on a price of a house in Oakley that I think was 130,000. You look back, bloody cheap.
Couldn't get a front door in Oakley for that money these days, Phil.
No, tell me.
So what's your advice then for developers that are sitting here listening, thinking, what should I be doing now? It's time to jump in and start scooping up land and getting projects started?
Get educated is the thing I say. Get educated about the cycle. Get educated in understanding earnings, and then go from there. It's important to understand and get educated about timing, and then understanding where earnings come from, land value. That's the most important.
Yeah, well, what's the saying? A rising tide lifts all boats.
Yes, it does. It does. Indeed, it does.
Covers up
you don't know how smart you are until the tide goes out.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we've seen that over the last couple of years, and then back in 2012, 2013 was a bit like that. That's actually when I bought my first development site in 2013, right at the bottom of the market.
Good timing, see?
No one wanted to buy it. I was able to look at it for months and months. It's just sad block of land that nobody wanted.
Yes, interesting.
I remember thinking about that as the market heated up and you were getting shorter and shorter periods of time to be able to look at a site.
Yes.
Even put an offer in. It was
and of course the shorter time you've got, the more emotional the decision becomes, right? And perhaps the third thing, not only learning about timing and earnings, but study of emotions. That's important too, very important. You just don't want to get carried away and become emotional with your developments and get attached and stuff. At the end of the day, it is a business.
Especially when there's that frothy, fervent period. That's when your alarm bell should be ringing loud and clear.
Yeah.
But sometimes you're in a bit deep by then. You're sort of committed, and you feel like you have to push forward. That's the only way to go.
Yes.
Anyway, what's the best piece of advice you have ever received, Phil?
perhaps it's not what I've ever received. It's perhaps what I experienced. There are no friends in business. I think if I was to say there was one thing I learned, that would be it. Business is business, and sometimes you really do work out sometimes who your friends are. That's what I learned the most. I think, I'd already worked out what I thought was the timing, and I already, from an accounting viewpoint, I understood valuation measures, so I could apply accounting to it. So from my point of view, I'd always suggest keep your friends out of your business.
Actually, speaking of funds, didn't you set up your own investment fund to try and put your timing to the test?
Yes, but not so much from a real estate point of view. Yes, I do contribute to a stock market fund that's run out of Adelaide with a couple of friends of mine. We're doing quite well, if I may say so.
You may say
again, so. I don't want to sound like any other economist or forecaster, but people who followed me for a few years, the number 7 is very important every 7th year, and stock markets, the Dow in the US, they tank every 7 years. So I had a very good idea the down move in 2022 was coming, because it had been down in 2015 and down in 2008 and down in 2001, down in 1994, 7-year history, right? Same as real estate, but slightly different years and timing, but it all comes together. And so, our fund was able to sit 50% in cash throughout 2022, and we were able to take up some good buying activity. If anybody does end up subscribing to my service, what I do that's unique is I have put together both the real estate cycle and the stock market. So I've often said that I think real estate people should understand a bit about the stock market, because the stock market leads. I've always also said that stock market people should understand a bit about real estate, because it's real estate at the end of the day that drives the cycle. And so if stock market people can see the peak in real estate, they'll know it's the peak in the stock market as well. And so these things, putting the two together, which I've done in my clock and in my book, gives you an enormous advantage. So again, in 2023, the cycles indicated that the bottom would be in March. I know for people who've never heard from me before, that's really hard to believe, but that's what we're able to see, simply based on some very simple cycles that aren't hard to learn. It's just a matter of knowing where to look, really. And you do start with the 18.6-year real estate cycle. It's the most important. It's got the biggest driving force, and it's the best one to come to terms with first, and then you can start adding a few layers to that within the 18.6 real estate cycle itself. So it's been great. Over the years, I've met some tremendous people, some really interesting people over the years that helped me study this sort of stuff. My co-director, Akil, being one in particular, which has been fantastic. It's been great to be able to communicate with so many interesting people. As you probably know yourself, there's really interesting people doing some really interesting things around the world. It's fantastic.
Yes, one of the benefits of being the host of a podcast is you get to talk to some of them, Phil.
Yes, indeed. It's great. And you see it. There really is some fantastic ideas out there for what people are doing. And even the way of, being able to build better, and different ideas, the way to how to build, and labour-saving devices and stuff. It's fantastic.
Yeah, well, that's one thing that there needs to be some improvement on, is the efficiency of how things get built, because
yes,
slower and slower in Australia, not faster and faster.
Yes, yeah, indeed.
Well, I definitely recommend your book to people, The Secret Life of Real Estate and Banking by Phillip Anderson. Definitely worth grabbing a copy of that if you're in property, which the listeners of this show will be. You've also got a website where people can sign up for info, and you've got, I think you've got a membership there where you provide insights. And just
join our blog, Property Sharemarket Economics. The blog, it's free. Sign up to the blog. It's completely free. Only needs your email address, nothing else. And we're not going to flog stuff to you every single day. It's just, we respect your address and stuff. We just send you a bit of information now and then, and if you like it, you can take it further.
No, I've signed up for it, and that is exactly right. You send really good stuff. It makes for
Yes.
really interesting reading. I like
Yes.
it. I really like
Yes.
it.
You won't get it anywhere else. I'll tell you that much.
No, it's true. It's funny, you read these books and you go, how come I haven't read about this anywhere else? But there you go.
Yeah.
Bringing it
Yes.
to you. So, yes, do that. Go get a copy of the book. I also recommend people get Akil's book. Was it The Secret Wealth Effect?
Yes. The Secret Wealth Advantage.
Secret Wealth Advantage. That's also really,
Yeah.
really good. So,
Very practical
yeah,
book. It's
it's
good.
really, you're right. He does do a really good job of sort of breaking down
Mm.
the the
Mm.
years. Sorry, all the segments of the cycle.
Yeah.
That's actually really
I can tell you, if a property developer in Australia picks up one of those two books, and if they've been in the game 20, 30 years, they're going to go like this. They're going to go, yep, I saw that. Yep, I remember that. Yep, I was there. I saw it.
Yeah.
I just know from feedback.
Yeah. That's when I did my shirt.
Yep.
That's when I had to sell my car.
Yep. Yep.
That's when I
We've all
bought the
been there.
boat.
Yep.
All right, Phil, anything else you want to mention to us before we wrap up and part ways?
No, that's it. That's good.
All right, well, it's been
Great.
really
Thanks.
fantastic having you on the show. I think it's a really great way to start 2024 with a chat to you about property market cycles and where we're headed. So I think there's a couple of really exciting years coming up for property development.
Yeah.
I've been
Good.
saying that myself for the last 6 to 9 months. So hopefully people get on board and start putting in place the things that are going to let them reap the rewards of what's coming up.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, Phil, thanks for being on the Property
Thanks.
Developer Podcast.
You're welcome.
Talk to you later.
You've been listening to the Property Developer Podcast. Tune in next time for more tips, ideas, and inspiration to take your developing to the next level. For more developing love, make sure to visit propertydeveloperpodcast.com.